Hi, everyone, and welcome. I'm glad you're here. Before we explore today's material, let's take a moment to ground ourselves in the ideas we've already been working with. You've seen how the conditions surrounding the brain, stimulation, cues, attention load, food related thoughts, cravings, and screen driven pressure shape how much clarity and mental energy the brain has available. You've also looked at how reframing can change the internal signals the nervous system receives, making everyday moments easier to navigate. All of that gives us the foundation for where we're going next. Today, we're shifting into how the brain actually learns new patterns and how steady repetition changes the way the mind responds to stress, decisions, and internal cues. We'll look at how thought control works in real situations and how early physical and mental signals can guide your adjustments, and how simpler decision making and problem solving naturally emerge when the brain isn't overloaded. The goal of today's lesson is to show how these skills fit together and how they reshape the brain's habits in a practical, realistic way. So mental self care becomes part of how you move through the day, not an extra task that you're trying to remember to do. So let's get started. One of the most hopeful parts of mental self care is realizing that the brain is always learning. It's not stuck in its old patterns, even if those patterns have been around for a long time. The brain responds to whatever we give it repeatedly. That means the old loops, the ones that feel loud, automatic, or exhausting, only feel powerful because they've been reinforced over time. And anything that's been learned can be unlearned or reshaped. Reprogramming the brain doesn't require big dramatic actions. It happens through small, consistent moments of choosing a new direction. Every time you offer the brain a steady thought instead of a stressful one, it learns. Every time you pause before reacting, it learns. Every time you shift your attention towards something meaningful, it learns. Every time you give yourself even 5 seconds of quiet, it learns. These tiny shifts begin to soften the older pathways, the ones that fed anxiety, cravings, urgency, or self criticism, simply because the brain isn't using them as often. When a neural pathway isn't activated regularly, it becomes less dominant. It doesn't disappear, but it loses some of its volume and its urgency. And at the same time, new pathways form around whatever you're practicing. If you practice calming thoughts, the brain becomes better at calming itself. If you practice noticing your body's signals, the brain becomes better at attuning to those signals. If you practice redirecting attention, the brain becomes better at shifting gears without the old internal struggle. This isn't magic, it's biology. And the brain strengthens whatever circuits are used the most. It also mirrors what it sees and hears, which is why the tone you use with yourself matters. When you speak to yourself gently, directly, or with even a hint of compassion, the brain responds. It takes in the tone. It adjusts its patterns around it. People sometimes imagine that reprogramming means wiping the slate clean. But what actually happens is much more human than that. Your mind begins to choose calmer interpretations on its own. Your reactions feel less sharp. Stress feels more manageable. You start recognizing your own internal cues more easily, and you find yourself responding to things in ways that match who you want to be, not who your old patterns trained you to be. Another important part of reprogramming is giving the brain consistency, not intensity. The brain doesn't need dramatic effort. It needs repetition. It needs reminders. It needs you to show up for yourself in small ways again and again so it can learn what safety, stability, and clarity feel like. Over weeks and months, this repetition creates a shift you can feel. You're not forcing yourself to be calm. Your system simply starts operating from a calmer baseline. You're not pushing yourself to cope better. The brain is naturally finding steadier solutions. You're not trying to become someone new. You're uncovering the version of yourself who is always there beneath the noise of old patterns. Mental self-care gives the brain the kind of inputs that help it rewire towards steadiness. Not through pressure, not through perfection, but through gentle, repeated choices that reshape the mind from the inside out. Thought control isn't about forcing the mind to behave or trying to eliminate certain thoughts. It's more about recognizing that you have some influence over where you place your attention and how long you stay there. Most people's thoughts run on autopilot. The brain pulls from whatever patterns it already knows, and those patterns replay without much input. Strengthening thought control starts with noticing this, not in a dramatic or self-evaluative way, but simply by observing what your mind is doing. You might catch it jumping to conclusions, replaying something that irritated you, or drifting toward familiar stress points. The point isn't to judge it. The point is to see it clearly. Once you notice a pattern, you have an opportunity to interrupt it. This interruption doesn't need to be elegant or even inspirational. It can be as simple as saying, "Hold on, I don't want to follow that line of thinking right now." That brief pause disrupts the momentum of the original thought and gives you space to redirect. The next step is choosing where you want your attention to go instead. This isn't the same as positive thinking. It's more practical. You might switch to whatever task is in front of you. You might return to a neutral thought. You might think about something that requires your focus. The specifics don't matter as much as the shift. Over time, these small redirections add up. The brain becomes less reactive and more capable of switching tracks when a thought isn't useful. You'll notice that spirals don't get as much traction. Stressful thoughts don't take over as quickly. You're not controlling everything your mind produces, but you are steering it more often. There's also a change in pacing. When the brain knows it doesn't have to chase every thought to the end, it naturally settles into a steadier rhythm. Thinking becomes less chaotic. You have more mental bandwidth available. You can choose how much energy a thought gets instead of being automatically pulled into it. Thought control isn't about perfection or constant vigilance. It's about recognizing that your attention is one of your most valuable resources and learning how to handle it deliberately instead of letting old patterns choose for you. The body often picks up on things before the mind does, and it sends out signals long before we recognize what's even happening. Most of the time, these signals are subtle. A shift in breathing, muscle tension creeping in, a change in posture, a quickened pace, or a sense of restlessness. None of this means anything dramatic. It's simply the body reacting to the environment. Tuning into these signals is part of mental self-care because the body gives you information the mind hasn't processed yet. You don't need to attach meaning to every sensation, but noticing what your body is doing can show you when your internal load is starting to climb. For example, if your shoulders tighten, you don't need to ask why or interpret it. The tension itself tells you that something in your environment or your thoughts is requiring more effort. If your breathing gets shallow, that's feedback that your nervous system is shifting gears. If your jaw tightens or your hands move faster than usual, the body is letting you know that your attention is under pressure. None of this is a problem as long as you catch it early. When you notice these signals, you can adjust before escalation happens. That might even mean slowing your movement slightly, pausing for a moment so your system can reset, or stepping away from a source of overstimulation. These aren't emotional decisions. They're practical responses to physical cues. The more you practice noticing the body, the more data you have about what's happening in your internal environment. This reduces guesswork. You're not trying to figure out why you suddenly feel overwhelmed. You already saw the signs building. This makes it easier to respond directly instead of getting pulled into reactions that create even more stress. There's also a pacing effect. When you're aware of the body's early signals, you can make smaller adjustments throughout the day rather than waiting until everything feels like too much. The body stops surprising you with sudden spikes in tension because you're seeing the smaller indicators along the way. Tuning into the body's signals isn't about being mindful or introspective. It's simply about noticing useful information and using it to prevent the system from getting overloaded. The body is already giving clear feedback. Mental self-care means taking that feedback seriously enough to act on it before things escalate. Mental triggers aren't mysterious. They're patterns your mind responds to in predictable ways. Most people have a handful of situations or dynamics that reliably make their thinking speed up, narrow, or get off track. When you understand what those patterns look like for you, you can catch them before they turn into something bigger. A mental trigger can be anything that puts pressure on your attention. It can be a certain tone of voice, a type of interaction, a particular environment, or even something on your schedule that always creates tension. None of these things are bad. They're simply moments when your brain is more likely to shift into a fast, reactive mode. The key is catching the early signs. Usually the mind gives you a few hints before it ramps up. You may feel your thoughts start stacking on top of each other, or you might become more task-driven than the moment calls for. Maybe you notice your patience shorten, or you suddenly lose interest in something you were doing. These signals show up long before overwhelm. When you notice the pattern early, you can respond in a straightforward way. You can slow the pace, take a short pause, step back mentally from the situation, or switch to something that requires less intensity. None of these responses need emotion attached to them. They're simply practical moves that help the brain reset before it gets overloaded. What makes this effective is timing. Most tools people reach for work better before a trigger fully lands. Once the brain is already in a reactive state, everything feels faster and harder to interrupt. But when you catch the pattern early, even small adjustments make a noticeable difference. Over time, you begin to recognize your own predictable triggers, not because you're analyzing them, but because you've seen the same pattern enough times to know how it unfolds. This makes the whole process simpler. You're not surprised by your reactions. You're just aware of how your brain tends to respond, and you know what to do next. Recognizing triggers isn't about managing emotions or diving into meaning. It's about understanding how your attention shifts and stepping in before the shift becomes disruptive. Decision making changes a lot when the brain isn't overwhelmed. When there's less mental clutter, it's easier to see the actual choices in front of you instead of getting pulled into all the extra noise around them. You're not trying to be decisive, you just have more access to your own reasoning. When the brain is under strain, decisions often feel heavier than they need to be. You might overthink small choices or second guess yourself before you've even made a move. That's not a personality trait. It's what happens when the frontal lobe is juggling too much at once. The brain tries to make sense of things but doesn't have the bandwidth, so everything feels complicated. With mental self-care, that load lightens. You can evaluate information more directly. You can sort out what matters and what doesn't without getting stuck. You're able to hold a decision long enough to see it clearly instead of bouncing between options. Another thing that happens is that reactive decisions, the quick automatic ones that come from pressure or stress, start to slow down. You have enough internal space to pause and think instead of responding to the moment's intensity. You don't need to coach yourself through it. The brain naturally shifts into a more deliberate pace once it isn't overloaded. You might also notice that decisions become simpler, not because life gets easier, but because your mind isn't trying to solve three different problems at the same time. When the brain is steadier, it doesn't turn every choice into a big evaluation. It focuses on what's relevant. It stays with a task. It doesn't create extra steps. Over time, this changes how you move through your day. You don't stall on basic choices. You don't overanalyze. You don't get stuck as often. You make decisions based on clear information instead of reacting from overload. And that makes the whole process more workable. Problem solving changes noticeably when the brain isn't running on fumes. When you're overloaded, even simple problems can feel bigger than they are. Your mind jumps ahead, imagines the worst outcome, or gets tangled in details that don't actually matter. That's not a personal habit. It's the natural result of a system under too much strain. With mental self-care in place, the brain has more room to sort things out. Instead of trying to solve everything at once, you naturally break problems into smaller pieces. You're not forcing yourself to be methodical. The brain simply stops panicking and starts organizing information in a clearer way. When the mind is calmer, it's also easier to separate the actual problem from all the extra interpretations you might normally stack onto it. Without that added pressure, the issue becomes more straightforward. You can look at it directly and decide what needs to happen next without turning it into something more complicated. Another big shift is that urgency drops. Problems don't trigger the same act now feeling when the brain isn't overwhelmed. You have enough space to think things through without rushing or spinning. You're able to evaluate the situation, consider a few approaches, and choose one without the internal scramble that often comes from stress. This also helps with staying oriented. When the brain is overworked, it's easy to lose track of where you are in the process. You start something, you get distracted, try another angle, jump ahead, backtrack, and end up more confused than when you started. With less internal load, you stick to one step at a time. You don't need to remind yourself to do that. The brain naturally does it when it has the capacity. Eventually, problem solving feels less like a mountain and more like a sequence of manageable steps. You don't need to rely on motivation or pressure. You're simply able to think clearly enough to move through the issue at a reasonable pace. This is one of the quieter benefits of mental self care. When the mind is steady, challenges don't automatically become crises. They're just tasks, and tasks are workable. At this point, you can start to see how each part of mental self care connects to the others. These aren't separate skills operating in isolation. They form a kind of loop where one improvement naturally leads to another, and the overall impact is bigger than any single piece. When you reduce mental load, whether by redirecting thoughts, limiting unnecessary stimulation, or catching triggers early, the brain has more bandwidth. With more bandwidth, clarity improves. You're able to think straight, stay with an idea longer, and sort information more easily. That clarity then feeds into a calmer decision-making capability. You're not reacting out of stress, so you're not making choices from a rushed or overloaded state. Instead, you're able to evaluate situations more directly, which usually leads to better outcomes and fewer complications. And better decision-making reduces the number of crises or tangled situations you have to clean up later. That lowers your overall stress, which keeps the brain from tipping back into overload. And when stress is lower, cravings tend to lose their urgency because the brain isn't searching for fast relief. Less urgency makes it easier to keep your attention on things that matter to you. That attention reinforces healthier thought patterns, which gradually reprogram the brain to default towards steadier interpretations. Those interpretations keep your internal environment calmer, which then makes it easier to spot and respond to body signals, triggers, early signs of strain. And all of these pieces feed each other. You don't have to master any of them for the system to start working. Small improvements in one area naturally improves the others. The result isn't dramatic on any single day. It's gradual. You notice that your mind doesn't jump around as much. Conversations feel less exhausting. Tasks feel easier to start and finish. You're not spinning in mental loops or working as hard to keep your thoughts on track. Daily life becomes more workable because you're using a brain that isn't constantly being pushed past its limits. It doesn't require big breakthroughs. It just requires steadier conditions. This is why mental self-care matters. It gives the brain what it needs to operate at a pace and level that makes sense for real life. As we wrap up today, the main takeaway is that mental self-care isn't an add-on or a separate task you're supposed to fit into your life. It's part of how you manage your day, your attention, and your energy. Everything we talked about, redirecting thoughts, lowering stimulation, catching triggers early, adjusting pacing, paying attention to body signals, all of it simply about reducing the amount of unnecessary strain the brain is carrying. When the brain isn't overloaded, it performs the way it's designed to perform. You think more clearly because your brain isn't competing with background noise. You make decisions more easily because your system isn't under pressure. You solve problems in a more straightforward way because the brain has room to analyze instead of react. You move through the day without burning through your mental energy by noon. These skills, they aren't dramatic, and they don't rely on a surge of motivation. They're practical adjustments that gradually change the conditions your brain is working under. And as those conditions shift, the brain responds. It steadies. It quiets. It becomes more efficient. You start noticing that everyday situations take less effort to navigate. Mental self-care works because it aligns with how the brain actually functions. It doesn't fight your wiring. It works with it. The goal isn't perfection or constant awareness. It's simply paying enough attention to the internal load that you can make smart, realistic adjustments throughout the day. Over time, those adjustments add up. They change how your mind operates and how you experience your own thoughts. So as you move forward, think of mental self-care as part of your operating system, a way to keep the brain running at a level that makes sense for the life you're living. When the brain has the right conditions, the rest of your skills become far easier to use. This is how you create a mind that's not fighting you, a mind that's actually ready for the day you're in. Mental self-care isn't a separate project. It's simply how you create better conditions for your brain to function. When you make these small shifts, the way you think and move through the day changes on its own. That's the foundation you're building. Thank you for listening.